What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia,
autism spectrum,
ADHD,
Gifted,
dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 90. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and I'm the author of Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom. Today, we're talking with Elizabeth Hamblet about the things that every parent and educator needs to know about supporting neurodivergent kids in the process of applying to and receiving support at the university level. She was also kind enough to give a bit of extra time to answer some of your questions, and we will share the video of those questions on our Patreon page and in our Facebook group before anywhere else. So, a moment ago, I mentioned my book, and drumroll please, it'll be out in less than a month. This book has been in the works for what feels like a really long time, and with the delay in publication due to the pandemic, for it to be right around the corner finally is both thrilling and a little terrifying. We're going to be holding a virtual book launch on the day of the release, which is August 24th. So you can come and join me on Facebook Live for an Ask Me Anything, a celebratory toast, and a book signing. I'll actually be signing and mailing out book plates for you to put in your copy. If you want to join in, you can go to the Neurodiversity Podcast Facebook page, follow us there, and check out our events to RSVP. We'll put a link to the Facebook page in the show notes, too. Another exciting thing that's on the horizon, I've been invited to be a speaker at Seth Perler's online summit on executive functioning. Seth was a guest on the podcast on episode 71. This is a free summit that is perfect for parents and teachers who are working to support the executive functioning of their neurodivergent kids. If you register, you get to watch over 20 hours of expert interviews. And again, this is totally free from August 20th through 22nd. If you want to register, we have a link on our website and, of course, in the show notes. Okay, then, up next.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hamblet, and I'm a college learning disability specialist, and I also write about and present on preparing students with disabilities for successful college transition.
Don't go anywhere.
As a new school year approaches, educators and school administrators are looking for new and better ways of identifying, supporting, and challenging gifted and twice exceptional students. A new book by Emily Kircher-Morris, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, gives you guidelines for identifying and understanding 2E students, helps you provide strength-based instruction, motivate them, and help them with self-regulation. It contains important information to help educators advocate for 2E students, including what they need to know about individualized education plans or IEPs and the Section 504 plan process. This important new book is now available for pre-order, and we're giving our listeners a 25% discount off the regular price. Go to neurodiversitypodcast.com, click the link, and enter the promo code 2EBOOK to buy the book and get the discount. Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom. Available for pre-order now and on store shelves August 24th. This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, we are talking to Elizabeth Hamblet. She is the author of From High School to College, Steps to Success for Students with Disabilities. So, Elizabeth, thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the experiences that have brought you to this role of supporting students who are transitioning from high school to college.
So it's sort of, I think, an interesting journey. I started my career in special education as a high school teacher, special ed teacher and case manager. And then I began working part-time at a local college. And it was only in starting to work there that I realized that nothing in my graduate program had explained to me what happens and what the shifts are when students move to college, as far as the shift in the laws and what those mean with regard to accommodations and student responsibilities. So I have been working now in college offices. I'm on my third university in about 20 years and have moved through these three places. And it just became a passion of mine a bunch of years ago to try to reach out to high school professionals and to parents to start to educate them about these changes so that the planning that was done at the high school level could be informed by that information.
That's just a confusing transition, I think, for families especially. And that jump from high school to college for kids who've had supports through, say, a Section 504 plan or an IEP can be really overwhelming, I think, mostly for the parents who've a lot of times had to spend, years advocating fiercely for their kids. Can you talk a little bit about what changes those families might expect through that transition?
Sure. And let me just start by saying that I love what you said about, parents really being involved in this and students maybe not paying as much attention to it. And I've met a lot of really great young people who are great advocates, but I think it's probably true that this means a lot more to the parents necessarily than it does to their students. And so, there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding and sometimes misinformation about this. So I always, I want to start by saying every college in the country has to provide accommodations, and I always say that with this little teeny tiny asterisk. And that is, in order to be exempt from these federal laws about accommodations, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, colleges have to meet 3 criteria. And the first is that they would have to refuse all federal funds. So that includes Pell Grants and, federal student loans and other kinds of money that colleges get from the federal government, which means that the pool of schools that could even meet that requirement is, infinitesimal. Nobody has a list of those schools that don't do this, but the last time I saw a list, which was easily 12 years ago, it was maybe 10 schools. Mm-hmm. So first they'd have to meet that, and then they would also have to be private and religious. So let's start by saying pretty much any place your student wants to go has to provide at least basic accommodations. But what's different about college is that those don't really look like plans. So I think the word plan is a really important word here, because a plan implies, as I started by saying, that you know what the goal is and you lay out steps to get there and you measure progress and all of that stuff. And so colleges typically write a letter of accommodation or an email of accommodation or whatever it is. That just says Elizabeth Hamblet is a student and she's been approved by our office for these accommodations, and that goes to professors. Some of our colleagues in the field call what I would call an LOA a 504 plan, which I think leads to some confusion. But let me be very clear. So IDEA, which is the law that oversees special ed in K through 12, doesn't even apply to colleges. And so the way we often phrase it at the college level is those IEPs expire, essentially. Once students graduate from high school, they're no longer legally applicable documents that a college has to follow. Now, if your student stays in school past the traditional graduation age, until they age out under IDEA, they can have an IEP. 504 is understandably confusing because 504 does apply to colleges, but there are different subparts. So K through 12 is under subpart D and post-secondary is under subpart E. And I have looked, there is no language that specifically says, and this means that your 504 plan is no longer legally valid, but that is the effect. And so, I've heard some concerning things from parents and even professionals over the years about schools or parents, moving students from an IEP to a 504 for their senior year of high school because they believe that a college will have to follow their 504 plan. And that's not true at all. So what it means in effect is colleges are not obligated to provide the same accommodations that a student had in high school simply because they were written into a plan. They may absolutely find them to be appropriate for that student, applicable at the college level, and approve them. But they don't have to. And there are going to be some categories of accommodations that students might have received in high school that just aren't available at college. And so that's where it actually matters that we're talking about, the 504 plans and IEPs expiring is families should have an understanding that there is no obligation to provide the same thing. Although in many cases, and I don't have stats for you, that does happen.
Can you talk a little bit about what is that process of even, how do they get that established? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. And what I think is important too, because I think you've made a really good point about these differences. Under plans, at least under IEPs, I didn't deal with 504s in my last high school job, but, you would write this plan with goals and objectives and you would measure progress. And I want to start by saying, that kind of stuff doesn't happen at the college level. And while that may make parents uncomfortable, they should sell it to their students, because for some students, it's all of those things that make them not want to register with our office. And so I'm going to describe the process to you in a moment, but in many ways, the contact that they're going to have with us is going to be minimal. And it is not going to be a system where we check up on them or with them and, monitor their progress and do all those things that, for some students are the, parts of special ed that they don't like. So, and in fact, it goes all the way back to, it's a student's choice whether or not they even want to register with us when they start college. And there was a huge research study done. Data was collected from 00 to 010, to 10, I think, 2010. And what they found was, I think it was something like only 24% of students with learning disabilities that had received at least one accommodation in high school registered for those at college. And I may have some of the details. That might have been the number for four-year colleges. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it speaks to how much reluctance there is among some students to do this. So if they want to receive accommodations, what they would do is go online to their university's site, type in disability services, and then sometimes they'll get taken to a link that says accessibility services or office for access. It doesn't always have the disability word in it. Click on that. I was just looking at a site that said register here, which is great. Sometimes they have to go under new students. It's not always so obvious where to go, and they should be able to find the process for registering, which typically involves completing a form where they say what their disability is. They might be asked, what parts of their functioning it affects, listening, reading, taking tests, where they're often asked what accommodations they want to request. And, sometimes they might get asked why they need it. Now, they will then also provide documentation of their disability, because simply filling out a form is not considered to be sufficient. And I would really like for your listeners to hear this. They're going to hear all sorts of things from others that you have to have this and it can't be that, it can't be this old, you have to have this kind of evaluation. And all of those things and none of those things are true. It really varies from college to college. And so they have to look at the specific requirements for the college the student will attend. And so there are some colleges that will take as documentation all by itself the high school 504 plan or the IEP, which also, in my opinion, is part of the reason things get confused, because people think if you submit your IEP or your 504 and they give you the same accommodations, it's because they're following them. But other colleges will require, for learning disabilities, testing. A lot of them are now saying within the last 5 years. Most require just a psychoeducational evaluation for learning disabilities, and that's, testing of your cognitive and academic abilities, not necessarily a neuropsychological exam. I think sometimes people who use that word think it's interchangeable with psychoeducational, but it's a whole different set of tests. And then, so they turn that in, and the school I was just looking at says that students they are required to set up an appointment with Disability Services for what's called an intake meeting. And I don't like to use the word interview, because that makes it sound like the student is applying for something or has to prove something. My colleagues say that they use these intake meetings to get a better sense of who the student is, maybe ask some follow-up questions about what was in the documentation or in their registration form, and to get to know the student a little bit better. And then once they are, assuming everything goes well and they aren't asked for more or different or updated documentation, then typically the school will generate what's called the LOA. And depending on the school, there are different processes. At a lot of colleges, the students themselves have to take those letters or email them to professors. But I've seen some colleges have this whole system for accommodations, and a secure message goes to professors through that. And then once they finish that part of it, every term that they're there, they often have to request their accommodations. It's not generated. Those letters are not generated automatically. Colleges don't look up who your professors are to make sure they send them to the right people. It would be your responsibility to let DS know. And a lot of colleges where Disability Services does the accommodated testing, students who get that often have to fill out a form to let the office know which exam, who the professor is, when their class is taking it, so that Disability Services can contact the professor and get that all set up. Mm-hmm. I started by saying there's not a lot of contact. I just talked a lot. But in the end, the amount of contact that requires is quite minimal.
I also think one of the biggest shifts is responsibility shifts from the school really to the student.
That's exactly right. So one of the things I say in some of my presentations is that there's no child find at college. It truly is the student's choice to register with us. And, they can delay that registration. There are students who, I've heard students say things like, well, I want to see that I can do it without the accommodations. I just want to fit in. I want to shed this part of my identity. All this stuff has been talked about in the research. So they can certainly wait. What they need to know is, when you talk about responsibility, what it means is that we don't make up for it if they get a bad outcome. So if you take your first set of midterms without your accommodations and you realize, maybe that wasn't the choice I would make again. We don't give you another chance to take your exam now with accommodations, and we don't wipe that grade out. Everything stands and the accommodations start from the moment you are approved.
It seems like the downsides of registering are pretty small compared to the upside. Mm-hmm. It's obviously better to be safe than sorry.
There are a lot of different kinds of reasons why students don't register. And I try to, sell it as what I call a free insurance policy. If you register with us and you find you don't need your accommodations, sort of no harm, no foul. We don't show up at your dorm room and say, you did register for these accommodations. Aren't you going to use them? Which I don't know that that's anybody's particular nightmare, but it's their choice. If they decide not to use their accommodations, that's absolutely fine. And then they can still change their mind the next term and say, actually, I do want my letters. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, one way to encourage them to register is to give them that sense that they will have that autonomy and choice. And, also, and I don't know that this is true, it's just my theory. I know when students take the SAT, and I don't know if it's true for the ACT as well, and they have extended time, they are stuck in that room for as long as the time is. They can't look at their phones. They can't read a book. They can examine their fingernails for 4 hours of, whatever it is. And for some of them, it's the only conscious experience they've had of extended time, or certainly the most severe. And so when you say to them, do you want extended time for exams? At high school, at college, they say, well, no, thanks. But as soon as you're done with that exam, you can leave. It's not SAT level security. So make sure that they know that so that they don't forego this opportunity.
As students and parents are even beginning this process, even just starting their college search, what are some of the questions that they should be asking?
That's a great question. And I do want to make a point that, there are colleges out there that they may hear about from people, that have special fee-based programs for students with disabilities. The University of Arizona SALT Center tends to be the one many people have heard of. I live on the East Coast, and a lot of them are located here. So those programs are good fits for certain students, but it is not true that if you have a learning disability, you should go to a school that has a fee-based program. It requires understanding of what those programs do and what they are intended to do, and have a good sense of students' needs. So I would recommend not limiting a student's search to those schools, which I know some parents anecdotally have told me counselors have encouraged them to do. Those are good choices if that kind of program is what the student needs, and also, by the way, is interested in attending. Finding a school with a fee-based program for a student who has no intention of using it is not a useful search.
What do people believe is the benefit of the fee-based programs? Like, why would they feel like that's a better option?
I think sometimes they don't. I don't want to put words in people's mouth, and I don't know that I can speak for them, but I think people who maybe don't have a lot of knowledge of the basic accommodations that all colleges have to provide may assume that that's the only way to get some supports. Now, in fairness, there are some supports that families are looking for that aren't provided for free as a basic accommodation. So, I run a Facebook group for parents, and there have been a lot of questions lately about executive function coaching. And so I am anecdotally seeing more colleges offering what they call academic coaching or academic mentoring. But it's very often not done by a trained professional person that it may be what families are thinking of when they think of who would do that. It's a successful upperclassman. And, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of them are hiring academic coaches. They don't always necessarily have a background in special education. So if you were looking for that kind of specific support and, the frequency of those check-ins. So at these programs, the fee-based programs, you often get 2 to 3 meetings a week with somebody, and it's a very structured meeting. And sometimes they have a full-time assistive tech specialist who can not only loan you the equipment, which many colleges do without having to have a fee-based program, but have the time and training to train students how to use that stuff. And again, sometimes that stuff is available without a special program. George Mason University in Virginia has a very robust assistive technology department, and there's no fee for that. So to try to circle back, I'm very bad at that sometimes. I think first you have to look for the college that's going to fit a student on all of the typical requirements. Size of class is an important thing. If your student is looking for small class sizes, that's not an accommodation for a disability. It's just a thing you have to go look for. Do they want Greek life? Do they want sports teams? Whatever that is. And then you can focus in on the Disability Services Office. And on my website for free is a download from my book that you can use to guide your research looking online at colleges, disability services sites. What accommodations do they say they commonly offer? Do they specifically say there are things they don't do? You'll find in looking that some offices will state right on their website, we don't do modifications. And that's not just particular, frankly, to the schools that say it. I had alluded earlier to the idea there are some accommodations students receive in high school that they don't typically get in college, and modifications where the standards for performance are changed. Anything that falls under that is not often provided. So being able to write a shorter paper than everybody else in the class. So not to get myself too off track, you may see lists of accommodations. I caution folks to be aware that this is just a helpful piece to show you what's available, but you should not assume that anything you see there is available to every student. You have to be found eligible. And to poke around and see how many people work in that office. Do they have an assistive tech specialist? What does it say that person does? Some colleges get assistive technology, such as text-to-speech software, and it's only available to students found eligible for it. However, some colleges buy these enterprise licenses where if you log into the system with your student ID, you can use it without having to even be registered. So those are the kinds of things that they can search for.
I think another piece for parents too is figuring out when to step in and when to step back as their kids go through this process, because it is kind of like I always kind of joke, college is kind of like this halfway house to adulthood. Like you have to kind of work your way through it. And so what advice would you give to parents about how to balance that?
Part of the challenge is students are along this huge spectrum of development and maturity. And so, I over many years, I have matured also, I like to think, and I've learned a lot and really kind of rethought my position on things. I find having your own children helps that too. But I think wherever possible to be sort of coaching from off to the sidelines. Again, I'm going to completely botch all of my sports metaphors, but to be coaching rather than doing for. So one thing that comes up in my group a lot is my student has her intake meeting coming up. Can I, in this current time, can I be on the call? Which COVID has provided people a lot of opportunity to be involved in parts of the process where sometimes your student would wait until they got dropped off at freshman orientation and have that intake meeting on their own. So, what my colleagues would say, some of them, is first of all, certainly your student has to give you permission to be there. And if your student does not give you permission, we will not talk to you. But even if your student does, what we want is for you to be there, for emotional support if the student is feeling anxious, and to wait to fill in the blanks where your student is struggling to remember something or express something, but to really let your student do the talking and the communicating and the expressing, because we need to have a sense of where they are. And so you may have some helpful details, but, sort of wait for your student to call upon you before volunteering that information. And then, once they're registered with us, a FERPA release, so a Family Education Rights Privacy Act release, is something your student can sign to give people at the college permission to talk to you. But a FERPA release is not a FERPA obligation. And what I mean by that is if my mom calls the office and says, "How is Elizabeth doing? I haven't heard from her in weeks." The Disability Services Office is not obligated to contact me and gather information to give to my mother. They are not required to contact my professors to see how I'm doing or to log into the course management system, if they even have that access, to see what my grades look like. And so, sure, everybody has heard the story about and again, it's sort of a apocryphal story, but I do believe some of these are true. The parent who gets the kid's email address and emails the professor as the student. I mean, these are things that do happen. They are certainly not common occurrences. But I think, I am sympathetic to parents who want to see their students succeed. That's why they do anything that they do. But I think that if your student requires so much of your support just to get through some basics, maybe the traditional move away, live at college, take on a full-time course load at a rigorous university is not the first step right now at this moment.
Yeah.
And what I worry about too is students' sense of self-efficacy and, their sense of self-esteem and their confidence, because I worry that if they can't do these things without so much support, their anxiety will go up. And I don't want to get too precious either. I mean, after I graduated, I did go back to graduate school, but if you don't do that, how often do you have to write a 10-page research paper in your adult life? So not all of those things are analogous to being an adult.
If you had a student who you were working with, sitting in with your office, and they were just very overwhelmed about the entire process, what would you tell that student who's in this process of either making the college decision or in their first semester and trying to navigate the university on their own?
I would say, get support. I think, one of the biggest myths among students is I should be able to do this on my own. And, we wouldn't have tutoring centers and writing centers and disability services and counseling if we didn't acknowledge that this is a hard transition and this is a place where you are expected to need support. And, many of my colleagues would echo the idea that it's the students who actually ask for support who are the most successful because they know what they need and they go get it. There's no shame in asking for help. Sometimes you have to be able to identify where is the right place to go. And, that's something as students move their way through high school, this metaphor of becoming a coach from the side, I think is a really important one for parents who I know, as you started this conversation by saying, have spent years advocating for their students, but really sort of turning over the reins to them and, coaching them and explaining, this is how you write an email. This is how long you wait for a response. This is an appropriate time to go talk to your teacher, which is not the start or the end of class when they're packing up to go to the next thing. But to teach them those skills and have them practice them so that when it comes to this, they have some experience saying, all right, I didn't understand half these math problems. I'm going to the math help room, but I will identify the ones I didn't do well and where I'm getting stuck, because help seeking is a skill, as strange as that sounds, and they'll be more comfortable doing it if they have some experience.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I strongly believe that the key to success for neurodivergent people is the ability to self-advocate. Too many neurodivergent people have grown up thinking that they have to try to continue to fit in a world in the way that the world has been created, instead of taking action to make it a better fit for them. Building self-advocacy skills from a young age lets students bring those skills to the university level and eventually the workplace. Watching our kids grow into independent and successful adults involves letting them gradually take that lead, and the transition to college is a natural step in that process. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Don't keep me down. 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 Don't keep me down.
Thanks again to Elizabeth Hamblet. For more information about her or her book, go to the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. While you're there, be sure to take advantage of the free registration for Seth Perler's online summit on executive functioning. Emily is one of the featured speakers. This is executive producer Dave Morris. Stay safe. Stay healthy. See you next time.
Don't keep me down. 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 Don't keep me down.
This is a production of Morris Creative Services.